and welcome to Bad Theology Busted, where we challenge the dangerous theology of Christian Zionism in all the places that it hides. This is the podcast of the Institute for the Study of Christian Zionism. My name is Dee, and I'm joined today by my co-host and my friend Jesse.
Thanks, Dee. We're joined today by Reverend Dr. Donald Wagner, a central figure in the founding of the Institute. We'll uncover the history of Christian Zionism and learn about why engaging in the work to combat Christian Zionist theology is so necessary. If you enjoy the show, please don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform. We'll be back after the break with working definitions of Christian Zionism and the theology it leads to.
Someone once said, in the beginning, God created us in His own image, and since then, we've been returning the favor. And I think today, many reflect their own supremacy and prejudice on the character of God. We must call for justice and accountability. The church belongs in the streets. We must call for justice and accountability. This is the path forward. We see the image of Jesus in the children of Gaza. In every child pulled from under the rubble, we see the image of Jesus. We're trying to reclaim the dignity and worth of these precious people given to them by God, yet stripped by the empire and colonization. We must call for justice and accountability. The church belongs in the streets. We must call for justice and accountability. This is the path forward.
Reverend Dr. Wagner received his Master of Divinity from Princeton Theological Seminary and a Doctor of Ministry degree from McCormick Theological Seminary. He was the director of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Chicago's North Park University until 2009, when it closed and Don was denied tenure. He is the author of several books, including his latest, Glory to God in the Lowest, Journeys to an Unholy Land.
And in addition, I want to plug what I believe is one of the best books I've read on the history of both Palestinian Christianity, but also of Palestine in general, Dying in the Land of Promise, Palestine and Palestinian Christianity from Pentecost to 2000. We have 25 years that we need to make up, but it's a phenomenal book. So I had the honor and privilege of first meeting with both Don and Stephen at the same time when I was in my final year at Fuller Theological Seminary. This was back in 2009. Working with Don on coordinating what was their on-campus 3-day Muslim and evangelical, actually, dialogue as part of a series of dialogues in response to what was the Common Word document, which was, some of you might remember that or have no idea what I'm talking about. We'll talk, We'll chat, and then we will take your words out of context and you or you. No, no, of course not.
I'm quite used to that with the Zionist federations and all that, yeah.
Thank you so much for being here with us today, Don. And so now that we've heard a bit about you, can you tell our listeners about what brought you into this area of scholarship and work?
Well, thank you both. And I'm just so grateful for what you are doing in carrying the ISCZ forward with Mimi and the others. What brought me into this, I think, was growing up a Christian Zionist in premillennial dispensationalism, and we can get into that a little later. I think some are very familiar with that. I kind of pulled out of that at around the age of 13. I kind of saw some problems, but then I went to seminary at Princeton and got into a liberal mainline Christian Zionism, the post-Holocaust, Niebuhrian type. And then I realized when I discovered Palestine, or Palestine discovered me, that my theology was really pretty warped. I was doing a doctorate at the time, and I decided to do my dissertation on Christian Zionism, realizing that Christian Zionism started before Jewish political Zionism. And that dissertation then led to Anxious for Armageddon book in 2005, I think it was published. But in those days, even in Anxious for Armageddon, I did not distinguish among philo-Zionism, evangelical fundamentalist Zionism, restorationism. I lumped it all together, mainly as evangelical. 10 years ago, I began to analyze it more on the biblical lines, thinking if we have the correct biblical analysis, we're going to resolve this, and realizing it's a political movement. So I've concentrated on a political critique using settler colonial analysis and liberation theology as the antidotes.
Every time I hear parts of your story, Don, I feel like I learned something new. And that's always really exciting, as I am a lifelong learner.
Actually, Dee, I'm going to jump in and just ask.
Jump in.
Just share that so you mentioned Anxious for Armageddon, and I was reading your first chapter of you going to this revival service in New York, you getting the full fire, brimstone, end of times, rapture sermon, you coming home to your grandparents' house, and they went to visit your neighbor. And suddenly you're all alone. You're left behind. You're in tears. And first, I just want to say, as someone who also comes from a conservative, evangelical, dispensationalist, Christian Zionist upbringing, I've been there. I know exactly. You walk into an empty room and you're like, what is this?
Yeah, okay.
What have I failed?
Yeah, it's a fear-based theology that really grabs you, especially as a little kid. Scared the hell out of me.
Now that we've sort of talked about what got you here in this work, what is your working definition of Christian Zionism, and what components make up somebody who is a Christian Zionist?
Yeah, talk about being a lifelong learner. My definition has evolved and is still changing, I think. The shortest definition, and I think Stephen Sizer came up with this, political support for Zionism. It's as simple as that. Christian, political, theological, and economics, political support for Zionism. A longer one is this. Christian Zionism is a pseudo-religious and political movement supporting Zionism's goal to eliminate the indigenous Palestinian people and replace them exclusively with Jewish settlers. Christian Zionism replaces Jesus and the prophets' message of inclusive love, justice, and equality for all with a racist ideology of displacement. This brings in the settler colonial concepts, even liberation theology, where you emphasize justice, equality for all. Now, my latest, and I'm doing a second version of Glory to God in the Lowest, and this is my latest version that'll be in that book whenever it comes out. Christian Zionism supports the political goals of Israeli Zionism, whether from an evangelical fundamentalist or liberal Protestant or Roman Catholic orientation, and is a perversion of the liberating message of the Hebrew prophets and Jesus of Nazareth. I even changed the word distortion to perversion. I would defend that. And I believe I'm trying to champion the need for denominations and global Christianity to denounce Christian Zionism as a heresy. The concept that is used is status confessionis, a technical term that Bonhoeffer invented in his critique of Nazi ideology and theology, was then used by the South African Black Christians in the rejection of apartheid theology. So I would submit it's time for status confessionis to be applied to Christian Zionism.
contextually, just for those people that might not know a lot about Christian Zionism and Zionism at its core, I think something you touched on briefly that I'm wondering if you can just expand upon a little bit is this idea, or not really an idea, it's a fact. It is a fact that Christian Zionism and Christian support for a Jewish homeland predates any variety and version of Jewish Zionism. You mentioned Bonhoeffer, and you mentioned the way in which the South African movement kind of took some of his language and applied it when they were trying to eradicate the theology that was perpetuating South African apartheid. I wonder if you can just connect the dots for people.
So Bonhoeffer was this great German theologian who initially was a bit anti-Semitic. He evolved in terms of that issue, and he realized the consequences of Nazism and its takeover of the German church, where the Gestapo would show up, and we're on the eve of this maybe here, knock on the door of the faculty or whoever and say, you got to sign this Aryan statement supporting National Socialist ideology, the racist Nazi program. Bonhoeffer, of course, refused that, went underground with the Confessing Church. Eventually, he died at the age of 39. But his history, his legacy, and martyrdom has really been revered. South African church took his model, and in fact, the first step was in Ottawa at the meeting of the World Alliance of Reformed Churches in 1982, when the Black Christians from South Africa were called to have communion with the white Reformed Dutch churches, and they walked out, led by Ellen Buzek, a Reformed theologian, and said, we can't have communion in South Africa in the white churches. Why should we do it here? It's time for a change. It became a theological critique of the racist ideology of apartheid and the lack of equality. And it had a big impact, too, on the churches coming to terms with apartheid and taking a stand. And Christian Zionism, I believe, is a racist, exclusive ideology that is a theology justifying replacement, destruction of land, property, even supporting the genocide that we see in Gaza. And the silence of the churches and the liberal churches, I think, is based on privileging Israel and Zionism because of either guilt for the Holocaust, and the post-Holocaust thing comes in, PEPs, PEP, progressive except Palestine. Mark Ellis called it the ecumenical deal. Say, let's have wonderful dialogue, let's get together, let's normalize the injustice and just be good friends, and we'll let Israel take care of all that without a critique. I'm sorry, those days are over. We need to really name this and be more aggressive in it.
Thank you, Don. I really appreciate the framing on, status confessionis. And you write actually about this Christian Zionism being very much an idolatry, a heresy. So the Institute recently put out the inaugural issue of Journal for the Study of Christian Zionism. You have an article in that. Are you able to just talk a little bit about your article and the importance of what you wrote about?
I'll be very brief. It's Does the Bible Support Genocide? It's just basically an essay to look at, there are cases where the Bible supports genocide. The Amalek texts are among them, the Joshua texts. But my argument is the Bible corrects itself in the prophets, even in sections of the Torah. And certainly Jesus is a huge correction to the violent, exclusive texts and those that might be used to support genocide. I do raise the need to declare Christian Zionism a heresy and for a movement of the status confessionis to be picked up.
Sometimes you sort of want to go, oh, let's shy away from the biblical message because, yes, there are stories. There's our violent stories. There's the Joshua conquest. But of course, as you read the whole story, as you theologize, you really pull out like, oh, no, actually, the message is very much a liberatory one. The sense of the more you dig into the scriptural message, the less Christian Zionist you become.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think, if you start with the first chapter of Genesis, God created everyone equal. And we are created imago Dei, in the image of God. And if we are created equal in the beginning, then this whole thing of exceptionalism, racist ideology, a racist Christianity, there's no place for it. Just the implied theology, and I think it's a distortion that God gave the land to Israel perpetually. Well, when you dig into that more deeply, the modern state of Israel is not coterminous or equal to biblical Israel. That's number one. Number two is you look at Genesis 12 and the giving of the land, in that theology, and you realize this is also the giving of the covenant. God is the one that initiates the covenant. The covenant has conditions of obedience, and the Torah spells this out very clearly. In Leviticus 19 and 20, you see several sins, and among them, you will lose the land if you violate the covenant, particularly if you fall into idolatry. There's a verse in that section that says, the land will vomit you out. You can lose the land, but you will not lose God's love in the covenant. You could even go into exile, as happened. So if you follow the scriptures, Israel loses the land. They are in exile, but then they are brought back and returned. And if you look at the Hebrew prophets, they are really tough on the king, the Israelites, and the idolatry. When you slip into militarism or idolize the king or idolize violence, Jesus just amplifies all of that. It's a call to the poor, a call to justice. Jesus had no exclusive theology of the land. The land is for everyone. In fact, God owns the land.
I'm going to plug a book real fast. Gene March's God's Land on Loan. So the good librarian and me wanted to make sure you all have that resource. I think it's just really important to note for people that this whole Christian Zionist theological framework is inherently very anti-Jewish, right? Like the whole point of Christian Zionist theology is that in order for Jesus to return again, there has to be an Israel that exists. Only then for all the Jewish people who don't convert and recognize Jesus as the Messiah to be slaughtered en masse and then spend forever burning in the fires of hell, right? So this theological framework is not only deeply, deeply harmful to Palestinians, Christians, Muslims, but it's also deeply, deeply harmful to our Jewish siblings as well.
I always remember Gershon Gorenberg, I think that's in that article, that he was interviewed on 60 Minutes and he was asked, well, what do you think about this Christian support for Israel from these extreme fundamentalist Christians? He said, it's basically a 3-act drama that they have. They support Israel, then you get the rapture, the tribulation. 2/3 of us die as Jews in the tribulation and the Battle of Armageddon. And then we're given the choice to convert to Christianity or burn in hell. He said, as a Jew, I don't like my options.
Absolutely. And it's so critical for us to know what we're up against. And so on that, Don, in your own words, please tell the listeners how ISCZ, the Institute for the Study of Christian Zionism, came into being.
Well, when I was still at North Park and I was unceremoniously dismissed under pressure from the Zionist community, and I think some Christian Zionists had a hand in that. In 2009, I organized a conference on Christian Zionism. Brought in Gary Burge, Stephen Sizer, Naim Atik, Barbara Rossing, who was a Lutheran theologian, wrote a terrific book on Revelation, several others, and Yaakov Ariel, who is a Jewish professor in North Carolina, evangelizing the holy people. He spoke very critically of Christian Zionism. And Gary convinced me to invite this Rabbi, Yechiel Pupko, from the Jewish Federation. He has just gotten to know him. I said, no way. We brought him in. And he got up at the end of a morning, and he was supposed to speak for 20 minutes on a Jewish perspective on Christian Zionism. And he proceeded to denounce Naim Atik, Stephen Sizer, and me as vile anti-Semites, and he was just raging at the pulpit. I called together all the speakers after that meeting and said, we can't just have a conference, we got to do something. And Stephen was there, and John Hubers, and we came up with the idea, let's create a website. Stephen was so adept on technology, I said, here's my credit card, see if you can get www.christianzionism.org. 20 minutes later, he's back, said, done. We launched it, and I was the first chair. And then the Jewish Federation forced the university to cut loose because it was under our Center for Middle Eastern Studies. And then I lost my job, and John Hubers took over as the chair. And he did a great job for about 7-8 years. And I became National Program Director for Friends of Sabeel. We formed a theology committee. And I got Sabeel Fosna to kind of be the shepherd of ChristianZionism.org. And I can't remember exactly where, but somebody said, we need to expand this website and go much deeper. Eventually, I called together a bunch of people, and Stephen became the first director, and Stephen was all part of this whole process. So I don't know who was the originator, but evolved out of FOSNA and our theology committee. Then finally we wised up. We got Dee, Mimi Kirk, Jesse, and now we've had our launch. And I am so excited to see how this has evolved and see what you all are doing. It is such a resource, and is going to be just a growing important force in the future.
I have a bit of a confession on that. Jonathan Kutab, the executive director of FOSNA, was invited to join the team. And at that time, I was also assisting Jonathan with his scheduling and his emails. And so I saw that invite, and I said, I sent out a little email to Stephen. Do you mind if I join? And I got the approval, and they said, okay, sure. And so I kind of snuck my way into the Institute that way.
Well, you are a major player now. So thank you for that.
No, I think I also snuck in. I remember, so back in, what was it, like 2021, I interviewed Dawn about, glory to God in the lowest. And out of that conversation, when we were done, you started talking about this institute and how you wanted to build a library. And I just flat out said, well, do you have a librarian on your team? And you said, no, but we probably should. And so here we are. I think that, I can speak for both Jesse and I to just say, like, we would not be here. This thing would not be here without you and Stephen and so many other people that are behind this initiative. And, it's the better part of 20 years in the making. So this is a marathon and a journey. And, it's so great that we are officially live.
Well, I am just honored to be a distant part of it and to see where you guys are taking it. It's so important. And the need for it just is exponential.
Expand a little on why you think the Institute's so critical on this need, and why should people be engaged with the work of ISCZ and what we're trying to do?
Well, I think, we're seeing Christian Zionism at its zenith these days. I mean, it is peaking. We don't know if it's going to continue to expand. But interestingly, Christian Zionism seems to thrive under authoritarians. That's something that should give people pause. Pew did a poll that's showing some younger evangelicals are distancing themselves from Christian Zionism. So there's a little hope there. And another reason why the Institute is important It's booming not only in the U.S., but in Central and South America, Africa, Southeast Asia. Netanyahu and the extremists are using that. That's where a lot of their support is coming from. This global dimension is something I think the Institute is going to really be important as they focus on that. Also, Harvard had a important monthly seminar that was directed by the Divinity School. And as part of the retribution of the Trump administration, but also the anti-Palestinian dimension of that at Harvard, they wiped out that whole thing. A dear friend, Hilary Rentisi, who was one of the directors of that, has lost her job. The dean was fired, and Christian Zionism was one of the major reasons. When Netanyahu made his statement about after the October 7th action by Hamas, annihilate Amalek, that was a signal both to the extremist settlers, but to the Christian Zionists. Because this false biblical endorsement of genocide. Christian Zionism also is antithetical to the gospel. We need not just to rescue it, but to critique and highlight what Jesus was all about, the Hebrew prophets. It needs to be an intersectional thing. It affects Palestinian Christianity and all Palestinians. It justifies their erasure. First stage is in Gaza right now, but that's also spreading to the West Bank. There's a concern of the future of Palestine and Palestinian Christians. We are at a stage where international law and democracy as we know it are at risk. And Christian Zionism and its authoritarian Christian nationalism play a role in undermining that. Are we going to lose international law? Are the criminal courts just going to be blown off? If Israel and the U.S. get away with this genocide, God help us.
I remember, again, growing up in my background, just the extent to which the United Nations, any international body, was so demonized. Like, this is where a one world government will come, or this is from whom the Antichrist will be. Any semblance of international cooperation, like so much of international law. If you look at Christian history, if you look at just war theory and what had been written up about how to, when you start wars versus how you engage in wars, so much of the international humanitarian law comes from church history, comes from religious law on how to do this. This is Christian principles, in many ways secularized in the 20th century, and especially after World War II and the horrors of there. And this post-war dream, they called it, I think, of never again, both, of course, never again with the Holocaust, but never again a world war. Sorry, I started preaching, so just let me...
What Israel is doing now with Iran, Gaza, Israel is involved in 6 wars, and we're underwriting it. And Christian Zionism, false theology, is providing part of the rationale. I guess I'd end by saying this is a Western problem. And we in the West, particularly the United States, have a huge responsibility to take this on. So these are huge mandates for ISCZ to consider. That's why your role in the future of ISCZ is so important as a global issue. It's bigger than we think.
And thank you, Don. No work going on in the future could have happened without the work that you have been doing and the foundations that you have laid for this movement for truth, for justice, for reconciliation. Thank you.
And thank you for your work. It's so vitally important.
Yeah, and we certainly can't do everything. However, we absolutely can do something. And, I think that really leads to being very loud, especially for our Palestinian Christian friends living on the ground who continuously are telling us that our faith is being weaponized to annihilate us. And so I think that, something that we can do is say, we're going to start doing the work necessary so that hopefully we can get to a place where your faith is not being a tool utilized for your own extermination. And so, ISCZ is really coming at such a dire moment when Palestinians, especially in Gaza, are being exterminated through starvation and bombing and all of these other things.
It's a Kairos moment. The hour is here.
And I invite you all to join us next time as we sit down with Reverend Dr. Stephen Sizer, another key figure in the establishment of the Institute for the Study of Christian Zionism.
Our original music, The Path Forward, was written and produced by Karl Saint Lucy and Danny Frye, featuring sampled speech by Reverend Dr. Munther Isaac.
ISCZ is a project of Friends of Sabeel North America, FOSNA, a interdenominational Christian organization that seeks justice and peace in the Middle East, in Palestine, through education, advocacy, and nonviolent action. And to learn more about ISCZ and to donate to our work, it's a long to-do list, as Dee mentioned, please visit us at studychristianzionism.org.
We must call for justice